could you share with us how to think about disease and sickness? What does the Bible say about disease and sickness? What does it say to encourage us as we encounter it and as our friends do?
So that's a great question, honestly, and it's something all of us have to deal with, right? I mean, whether it's a small illness or whether it's something major in our lives and families. There's a message that I did, and it's been years ago now, but a message that I did, at some point I want to preach it again, where I fill that out in greater detail. It's in James 5, the passage there about praying for the sick. And I give a little theology of illness in that message, or there are a couple messages there in one of those. So if you're interested in filling that out some. But here's the short version. We need to understand that illness and death, disease, decay, all of those things are part of the curse. They're part of the fall. And so they're not good. Ultimately, all of those things will be destroyed. In fact, I was talking with the elders this morning. I love the way Revelation puts it when it says in the end, Jesus will throw death and the grave into the lake of fire. Paul says death is an enemy. So is disease. That's why you see Christ in his compassion so often healing people in his earthly ministry. Sometimes, as I mentioned last Sunday, not because they're his disciple or going to become his disciple, but simply out of the compassionate heart of God. So you have to start there. You have to understand that in the Garden of Eden, there were no illnesses, there were no diseases. It's part of the curse, it's part of the fall. So understand then that one day it will all be destroyed. We will have new perfect bodies that will be impervious to disease and illness, and won't that be wonderful, right? So in the meantime, as we think about the issue of disease, we have to understand that sometimes God afflicts people with illness for specific purposes. Sometimes it's simply part of the fall. It's part of living in a fallen world. You get colds and everybody gets colds because that's part of living in a fallen world. But sometimes God intervenes directly in order to give an illness to someone. Sometimes it's for a specific purpose. But let me back up from that and say, first of all, just to make the larger point, God says, I wound and I heal. So ultimately, he takes the responsibility for the infliction of disease and illness and even death. Jesus said in Revelation 1, I have the keys of death and the grave. But while he takes the ultimate authority, that doesn't mean that it's a good thing that it's in the world. It's not. It's part of the fall. It's part of the curse. And one day it'll be eradicated. But sometimes he intervenes directly to give illnesses for his own specific purposes. You remember in John 9, Jesus talks about the blind man. The Pharisees had this retribution theology that you could look at a person's life, and if they were going through hard times, wow, you knew God really wasn't happy with them. And if everything was going great, then God was happy with them. Well, that's not the way it works in the real world. I mean, Jesus Christ suffered more than anyone, and yet God said, with him I am well pleased. So we can't think like that. But what God does at times is he brings illness for his own purposes. In John 9, where I was a moment ago, basically he says this is for the glory of God. This man has this blindness not because of anything in his life, not because of any sin, but because God wanted to accomplish something greater. He wanted to put himself on display. Sometimes it's as simple as that. In 1 Corinthians 11, he said there were some sick in the church in Corinth because of their sin. So God can use illness as a punishment for sin, as a corrective. Punishment wouldn't be the right word with his own, but as a corrective, as a discipline in our lives. And I think that's what's going on in James 5, by the way. I think there it's not just any illness that's in that context, but it's an illness that the person who's ill thinks is tied to their sin. And that's why they call for the elders and ask the elders to pray, and then James makes the point, if he sinned, then it'll be forgiven him. I think it's because he thinks that perhaps this illness in his life is tied to his sin, as it was with the believers in 1 Corinthians 11. Other times, so sometimes God directly brings these things into our lives. Other times, the scripture is clear that God allows Satan to bring these things into our lives. I mean, in Job 1, right? And in Job 2, as the story unfolds there, Job is afflicted with an illness, and it is at the permission of God, but it's at the initiative of Satan. And so it's never out of God's control. Some of you are from charismatic backgrounds, and let me just tell you, you don't have to worry that Satan's going to somehow get one over on God. Luther was absolutely right. The devil is on a leash. God permits him to go so far and no farther, and he uses it for that purpose. So my point in all of that, Kathy, is God has purposes, and sometimes we can discern those purposes and sometimes we can't. So then the issue is, so how do we respond? And that brings us back to the basic passages on trials and suffering, right? We can understand some of what's going on in the larger level, but we can't always apply that directly to our situation. God has a purpose, but he doesn't always tell us, just like he did in Job. And so what we have to do then is respond to that suffering in a biblical and godly way. The book of Job is a great example of that as we bow to the sovereignty of God in suffering. And we allow God to be God. The last chapters there, Job 38 through the end of the book. I think James 1 is a great example of how we're to respond to suffering. Romans 5, verses 3 and following there, where he talks about, think about what God uses suffering for. In fact, look at that. Just turn there with me, and then we'll move on to the next question. But and you can listen again. There's that message gives you a fuller version of that. But Romans 5, verse 3, as he's talking about the immediate effects of justification, he says, therefore, having been justified by faith, verse 1, certain things are true. And here's one of them, verse 3, we exult in our tribulations, and the word is a general Greek word that means all of the pressures that come in life. It includes illness, includes sickness. We exult in them. Why? Knowing. It's not because we like hurting. It's because of what we know. And here's what we know. We know that tribulation brings about perseverance, endurance, the ability, the Greek word is the ability to remain under. It's like a weightlifter who has to hold the weight up for a certain period of time. And as he does that, his muscles grow in strength. That's what trials do in our lives. The trial Sheila and I are going through right now, we would not have been as well prepared to deal with this when we were younger in the faith. The Lord would have given us grace. He would have allowed us to do that. But we've learned by building endurance. It brings about perseverance. And perseverance, proven character. In other words, the more you endure in your faith in the midst of trials, it proves who you are. Not to God, he already knows, but to you. You endure, you stay faithful in the midst of trials. You get the C word, cancer, and you remain faithful to the Lord through that. You trust him, you serve him, you obey him. It proves you're the real deal. Like you're not the ground, the soil that was prone to sprout up and then difficulties come and you're gone. And he says it brings about proven character, and proven character, hope. It strengthens your hope. As you see who you are, I really am a believer, and one day I'm going to be done with the troubles and pressures of this life. It's temporary, and it's light, Paul says. Momentary and light, and it's working for me an eternal weight of glory. And so it builds hope, and that's the process that trials do. And that's true with sickness. It's true with every other form of trial. So I would say then, understand the big picture, that God is the one who wounds and heals. He takes ultimate responsibility. Sometimes he interacts directly. Sometimes he allows Satan. But regardless, he has a purpose. He has a plan. Romans 8:28 is still true. He will not allow anything in our lives, if we're genuine Christians, that he doesn't intend to use for our good. And how does he use it for our good? Romans 5, 3 and following, James 1. And so you concentrate on those passages, all right?